My mother found our love letters in the oak tree and read them aloud to Pastor Thompson and 23 church elders while planning my conversion therapy in Texas, so I left through my bedroom window at 3 a.m. That was 2 years ago. She still sets my place at the dinner table every night and tells the empty chair about her day. I'm 19 years old, and I just escaped from a life that was slowly killing me. Growing up in a tiny, ultra-religious southern town where Trump flags outnumber stop signs, I always knew I was different. I just didn't realize how different until I fell in love with a girl named Bobby. My homeschooled, sheltered existence hadn't prepared me for what would happen when our secret came to light. My family and entire community are hyper-religious and openly hateful toward anyone who doesn't fit their narrow worldview. I haven't known anything except this dingy little town, but that type of hate has never felt right in my heart. When I was about 14, I realized that I was different. All the other girls in town were lusting over boys, but they did nothing for me. I cried so hard the day I realized I liked girls. I was scared of going to hell, and I knew this would only make me more of an outsider than I already was. I kept my identity a secret, thinking I would never be able to live out my dreams of falling in love with a beautiful girl. My mom had been telling me since I was little that it was my godly duty to find a good husband and give him healthy children, but God works in mysterious ways, and I could have never expected him to send me an angel of my own soon enough. It was a Sunday in spring when we met. My allergies were acting up. I kept sneezing during the sermon, so my mom told me to stand outside until church was over. I walked to the back of the big white church, and when I turned the corner, I saw a girl I had never seen before. She was beautiful, with freckles and thick dark hair, and when she turned to face me, I saw a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. It felt like someone lit a candle inside me, and I walked over to her as I felt heat grow in my chest. She gave me a big smile, revealing that she was missing one of her front teeth, but she didn't need it, and I could have dove into her big brown eyes like they were pools of chocolate syrup. She introduced herself as Bobby, said her family had just moved to town, and she hated it so far. I could tell she talked a lot as soon as the conversation started. She went on and on, but I could have listened to her all day. She talked about how she had gotten kicked out of her old high school, and her parents had moved to a more religious area, hoping that it would improve her behavior. She offered me her cigarette as she spoke, and I took it to seem cool. She stopped talking when she saw me struggling to inhale the smoke, and she let out this cheery little giggle. That's when she told me to hit her cigarette again, but this time take a big deep breath when she put her hand on me. She put a hand flat on my heart and looked into my eyes as she told me to inhale. That time, I successfully hit the cigarette, and when I exhaled the smoke, I realized that this mysterious girl standing in front of me was my very first crush. From spring into summer, we got to know each other better and better. Bobby was everything I wasn't: loud, unapologetic, a rule breaker, and halfway into the summer, I realized I was falling in love with her. We were inseparable. We would spend our days sitting side by side, dipping our feet into warm creeks, and at night we would lay a big blanket out in some secluded field and stargaze until we fell asleep in each other's arms. One night, Bobby stole a massive firework and we set it off without realizing just how huge it was. The explosion lit the sky up and triggered car alarms. We ran away from the scene laughing and holding hands. We ran into one of our neighbors' barns, shushing each other and giggling as we listened to the chaos we created. Our hushed laughter died down, and we stared at each other in that dark barn, a tiny sliver of moonlight peeking in from the ajar door. The soft blue light caught her deep brown eyes, and I held her face in my hand and told her I loved her. She just stepped forward and took me in her arms. The next thing I knew, she was pushing her fingers into my hair and kissing me deeply. We sunk to the floor together, kissing passionately and telling each other how much we loved each other. We stayed in that barn for hours, talking about our feelings and holding each other. We knew our families would never accept us, so we agreed to keep our relationship a secret for now. We were both legal adults. I was 19, Bobby was 18, but neither of us had any skills or money of our own. We made a plan together that night in the barn. We were going to run away together. We didn't want to keep our love a secret forever, and we both knew the only thing we cared about in this crappy little town was each other. We decided we would start saving money in secret, and in a couple of months we would leave and never look back. We thought we were so clever with our plan, sneaking around and saving every penny we could find. But in a town where everyone knows everyone's business and the church controls everything, keeping secrets is nearly impossible. What happened when they found out about us changed everything and forced us to run much sooner than we ever imagined. The next few weeks tested us in ways we never expected. I started picking up extra shifts at the general store in town, telling my mother I wanted to contribute more to the household. She seemed pleased, thinking I was finally becoming the dutiful daughter she'd always wanted. Meanwhile, Bobby found work at Jimmy's mechanic shop on the edge of town, doing oil changes and tire rotations under the table for cash. Her hands were always stained with grease when we met up, and she'd joke about how she was finally putting her rebellious streak to good use. We developed a system for our secret meetings. Every Tuesday and Thursday after my shifts, I'd walk to the creek behind the old Miller property where Bobby would be waiting. On Sundays after church, while my family lingered for fellowship hour, I'd slip away to meet her in the abandoned barn we'd confessed our love in. Each stolen moment felt precious and dangerous. One particularly hot July afternoon, I was restocking shelves when Mrs. Henderson from church cornered me near the canned goods. She grabbed my arm with her bony fingers and leaned in close, her breath smelling like peppermints and judgment. She told me she'd seen me walking with that new girl and warned me about keeping bad company. My heart hammered so hard I thought she might hear it. I just nodded and mumbled something about Christian charity while she lectured me about the importance of choosing godly friends. That evening, I practically ran to our meeting spot. Bobby was already there, sitting on a fallen log and smoking one of her cigarettes. When she saw my face, she immediately stood up and pulled me into her arms. I buried my face in her shoulder and breathed in the mix of cigarette smoke, motor oil, and something uniquely her. She held me while I told her about Mrs. Henderson, and then she pulled back to look at me with those deep brown eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wad of cash, $47 in crumpled bills. It was her first week's pay from the shop. We sat together and counted our combined savings so far, $83. It wasn't much, but it was a start. We figured we needed at least $500 to get us somewhere safe and keep us afloat until we found real jobs. The close calls started happening more frequently. One night, Bobby's mother almost caught us holding hands behind the grocery store. We'd been walking together after I closed up shop, and her mom had come looking for her. We barely had time to jump apart before she rounded the corner. Bobby's mother gave me a long, suspicious look before dragging her daughter home with warnings about curfew. My own family started asking questions too. Where was I I going after work? Why did I smell like cigarette smoke? Who was I spending time with? I became an expert at half-truths and misdirection. I told them I was helping organize the church library, visiting elderly Mrs. Patterson, anything to buy us more time. August brought new challenges. Pastor Thompson started paying more attention to me during services, his eyes following me whenever I moved. He'd taken a special interest in the youth of our congregation lately, warning about the corrupting influences of the modern world. One Sunday, he pulled me aside after service and told me he'd noticed changes in me. He said I seemed distracted, less devoted. He offered to pray with me, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes. I knelt with him on the hard church floor, praying silently for forgiveness for the lies I was telling while he prayed aloud for my soul. Bobby and I grew more creative with our meetings. We'd leave notes for each other tucked into the hollow of an old oak tree near the creek. Simple things, drawings of hearts, times to meet, little jokes to make each other smile. I kept every single one hidden in a shoebox under my bed. The work was exhausting. My feet ached from standing all day at the store, and Bobby's hands grew rough and calloused from the mechanic work. But every dollar we saved felt like a step closer to freedom. By the end of August, we had $212 hidden in an old coffee can that Bobby kept buried behind the shop. One evening in early September, everything almost fell apart. We were in our usual spot by the creek, and Bobby was showing me a map she'd found of cities up north. We were so absorbed in planning our future that we didn't hear footsteps approaching until it was almost too late. I looked up to see my younger cousin, Matthew, standing 20 feet away, staring at us with wide eyes. Bobby had her arm around me, the map spread across our laps. Time seemed to stop. Matthew was only 12, but he was smart enough to know what he was seeing wasn't right by our town standards. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Before I could speak, Bobby stepped forward and called out to him in her cheerful voice, asking if he wanted to see something cool. She pulled a small firework from her pocket, she always carried them, and lit it right there by the creek. The small explosion of colors reflected in the water, and Matthew's suspicion melted into delight. She gave him 2 more fireworks to take home, making him promise not to tell anyone where he got them. As he ran off, clutching his prizes, we both knew we'd bought his silence, at least temporarily. But it was another reminder of how careful we needed to be. The pressure was building from all sides. My mother started insisting I spend more time with the other young women from church, arranging tea visits and Bible study sessions I couldn't refuse without raising suspicions. Bobby's parents grew stricter too, implementing earlier curfews and checking her room at night. We adapted. Our meetings became shorter but more intense. We'd steal 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Every touch, every whispered "I love you" felt like an act of rebellion. The money in our coffee can grew slowly. $280, $310, $345. One night in mid-September, we met in the barn during a thunderstorm. The rain pounded on the roof as we held each other, and Bobby told me she'd heard her parents talking about sending her to stay with her strict aunt in Alabama if she didn't shape up. The thought of being separated made my chest tight with panic. We clung to each other in that barn, making promises we weren't sure we could keep. The storm that night seemed to mirror the turmoil building in our lives. After Bobby shared her parents' threat about Alabama, we sat in that barn for another hour, mapping out a more urgent timeline. We couldn't wait months anymore. We had maybe 6 weeks at most before her parents followed through. The next morning, I woke with new determination. At the general store, I volunteered for inventory duty, which meant extra hours and overtime pay. Mr. Jameson, the owner, praised my work ethic, never suspecting that every dollar went straight into our escape fund. I started selling things too. Old jewelry my grandmother had given me, books I'd collected over the years, anything that wouldn't be immediately missed. Bobby doubled her efforts at the mechanic shop. She took on the dirtiest jobs that others avoided, coming to our meetings with oil so deeply embedded under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove it. She'd show me her hands with pride though, saying each stain was proof of how hard she was fighting for our future. Our Tuesday meeting that week almost didn't happen. My mother announced at breakfast that she'd arranged for me to help with the church nursery that afternoon. I couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful, so I sent Bobby a coded message through our oak tree system, a simple drawing of a clock with an X through it. When I finally escaped to the creek 2 hours late, she was still there, sitting on our usual log with her knees drawn up to her chest. The relief on her face when she saw me made my heart ache. We only had 20 minutes before I'd be missed, but we made them count. She showed me her latest earnings, $62 from a particularly grueling week. Our total was now $407. So close, yet still not enough. Pastor Thompson's scrutiny intensified. He started showing up at the general store during my shifts, claiming he needed various supplies but spending most of his time watching me work. He'd make comments about the importance of young women maintaining pure hearts and minds. Once, he mentioned seeing me walking alone near the Miller property and suggested I should be more careful about where I wandered. The fear that crept up my spine at his words stayed with me for days. We changed our meeting spot to an old storm cellar behind the abandoned Hawkins farmhouse, 2 miles outside town. It meant longer walks and more elaborate lies, but it felt safer. October arrived with cooler weather and increasing desperation. Bobby's parents had contacted her aunt in Alabama, setting a move date for early November if Bobby's attitude didn't improve. We had less than 4 weeks. I picked up a second job cleaning the church in the evenings. It was deeply ironic, scrubbing the floors of the place that would condemn our love while saving money to escape it. But it added another $40 a week to our fund. My mother was thrilled, seeing it as a sign of my growing devotion. One evening while I was cleaning the sanctuary, I overheard Pastor Thompson talking to Deacon Richards. They were discussing the corrupting influence of newcomers in town, and though they didn't mention Bobby by name, I knew they meant her. Pastor Thompson said he'd been keeping a close eye on certain young people who seemed to be straying from the righteous path. My hands shook as I continued mopping, pretending I hadn't heard. Our meetings became even more fraught with danger. We developed elaborate signals. A specific pattern of stones arranged by the creek meant it was safe to meet, while a broken branch in our oak tree meant stay away. We communicated through notes more than conversations, each message a potential piece of evidence if discovered. The second week of October brought a close call that left us both rattled. I was leaving a note in our tree when Mrs. Henderson's son, David, appeared on the path. He was 17 and had always made me uncomfortable with his lingering stares at church. He asked what I was doing so far from town, stepping closer than necessary. I stammered something about enjoying nature walks, but his skeptical expression told me he didn't believe it. He walked me back toward town, asking probing questions about my friends, my activities, whether I had a boyfriend. Each question felt like a trap. When we finally parted ways, he said he'd be keeping an eye out for me, to make sure I stayed safe. The threat in his words was barely veiled. I warned Bobby Bobby through our note system, and we avoided the oak tree for a week. Our only contact was through glimpses at distance. Her walking past the general store, me catching sight of her at the gas station. It was agony being so close yet unable to touch or speak. By mid-October, we had $489. Bobby had started selling her possessions too. Her guitar, some tools, anything valuable. We were so close to our goal, but time was running out faster than money was coming in. Then came the Wednesday that changed everything. I was working at the store when Bobby burst through the door, her face flushed with panic. She grabbed a random item off the shelf and came to my register, leaning close as I rang her up. "Tonight," she whispered urgently, "the storm cellar. Midnight. It's important." Before I could respond, she was gone. The rest of my shift crawled by, my mind racing with possibilities. Had her parents moved up the Alabama timeline? Had someone discovered our secret? I told my mother I felt sick after dinner, retreating to my room early. I waited until the house was silent, then crept out through my window, a skill I'd perfected over months of secret meetings. The walk to the Hawkins farmhouse felt endless, every shadow a potential threat. Bobby was already in the cellar, pacing in the small space. When she saw me, she pulled me into a fierce hug that told me everything I needed to know. Something was terribly wrong. "My mom found the money," she said, her voice breaking. "Not all of it, but enough." She demanded to know where I got it, why I was hiding it. I made up a story about saving for a car, but she didn't believe me. She's watching me like a hawk now. They moved up the Alabama trip 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks. The words hit me like a physical blow. We did the math desperately. We had most of our money, but could we survive on $489? Where would we go? How would we leave without being caught? We stayed in that cellar until nearly dawn, planning and replanning. We decided we'd leave in 10 days, giving us just enough time to gather the last few essential things. Bobby would steal her father's truck. She knew where he kept the spare keys. I'd pack light, only what I could carry in a backpack. We'd leave on a Sunday morning during church when the whole town would be occupied. The next days passed in a blur of preparation and paranoia. I gathered important documents, my birth certificate, social security card, the few $100s I'd managed to save from my legitimate earnings. Each item I packed felt like another step toward freedom and another betrayal of everything I'd known. Bobby and I could barely risk meeting, exchanging only quick notes and meaningful glances. Her parents had her on lockdown, driving her to and from work, checking her room nightly. My own mother commented on how tired I looked, suggesting I might be working too hard. If only she knew the weight I was carrying. 5 days before our planned escape, Matthew approached me after church. My blood ran cold as he looked up at me with knowing eyes. "I know about you and that girl," he said quietly. "The one with the missing tooth." My heart stopped. I knelt down to his level, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" "I saw you kissing," he said simply, "by the creek last month. You thought I left, but I came back for another firework." The world tilted. A 12-year-old held our fate in his hands. I struggled to find words, but he continued. "I won't tell," he said, glancing around nervously, "but only if you take me with you when you leave." The request was so unexpected I almost laughed. Take a 12-year-old on our escape? It was impossible. I tried to explain gently that he was too young, that his parents would worry, but his face hardened. "Then I'll tell Pastor Thompson tomorrow," he said, and I knew he meant it. I agreed to think about it, buying time I didn't have. That night, I met Bobby in a desperate rendezvous behind the gas station, sharing Matthew's ultimatum. We were trapped. We couldn't take him, but we couldn't risk him talking either. Bobby, brilliant as always, came up with a solution. She'd give him something better than escape. She'd give him power. The next day, she found him after school and handed him a notebook filled with harmless but embarrassing secrets about various townspeople she'd observed. Things like Mr. Johnson sneaking cigarettes behind his wife's back, or Mrs. Clark's secret romance novel collection. Nothing harmful, but enough to make a 12-year-old feel important. "Information is power," she told him seriously. "Keep our secret, and I'll keep adding to your collection." It worked. Matthew walked away clutching the notebook like treasure, his silence bought with gossip instead of geography. 3 days before our escape, everything accelerated. Pastor Thompson announced a special prayer meeting for the wayward youth of our congregation, staring directly at me as he spoke. My mother insisted I attend, of course. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening, the night before we planned to leave. I sat through that meeting with my nails digging into my palms, listening to Pastor Thompson rail against the unnatural influences creeping into our community. He spoke of young people being led astray, of the importance of reporting suspicious behavior to protect the innocent. Several parents nodded along, including Bobby's mother, who sat in the front row with a grim expression. When he called for anyone struggling with unwholesome thoughts to come forward for prayer, his eyes found mine again. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. I stayed in my seat, but I could feel the suspicion radiating from him. After the meeting, my mother was unusually quiet on the drive home. Finally, she spoke. "That Thompson boy, David, mentioned he's seen you walking alone outside town quite often." My throat constricted. "I like nature walks. They help me think about God's creation." She nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Perhaps I should join you on these walks. It's not safe for a young woman to wander alone." I agreed meekly, knowing I'd never take another walk in this town again. That night, I barely slept. Everything was packed, hidden in a bag in my closet. Bobby and I had exchanged our final notes. She'd steal the truck at dawn, pick me up at the corner of Maple and 3rd at 6 a.m. while everyone was preparing for early service. We'd drive north until we ran out of gas, then figure out the rest. Saturday dawned gray and humid. I forced myself through the motions of a normal morning, helping my mother with breakfast, ironing my church dress for the next day. Every action felt like a performance, and I was terrified someone would see through it. That afternoon, while my mother napped, I slipped out one last time. Not to meet Bobby, that was too dangerous now, but to visit our oak tree one final time. I needed to see it, to say goodbye to the place where our love had grown. But when I reached the tree, my heart sank. Pastor Thompson stood beside it, holding a handful of our notes. He looked up as I approached, his face a mask of righteous fury. "I knew it," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I knew that girl was corrupting you." I stood frozen as he read from one of Bobby's notes. Her words of love turned into evidence of sin in his mouth. When he finished, he looked at me with something between pity and disgust. "Your mother is waiting for you at home," he said, "as are Bobby's parents. We'll handle this situation appropriately." The walk back to my house felt like a death march. I could run, but where would I go? Without our money, without Bobby, without a plan, I was trapped. My mother waited on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Behind her stood my father, his expression carved from stone. In the living room, I could see Bobby's parents, their faces twisted with anger and shame, but Bobby wasn't there. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Gone," her father spat. "Ran off like the coward she is, left this behind." He threw something at my feet. Our coffee can, empty now except for a single note. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. Bobby's handwriting, messier than usual, probably written in haste. They found out. Had to run. Took the money. I'm sorry. I'll come back for you. I love you. Wait for me. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. She'd left. Without me. The betrayal cut deeper than any condemnation from my family could. You're lucky, Pastor Thompson said from the doorway. That girl showed her true nature by abandoning you. Now we can focus on saving your soul. What followed was a blur of prayers, lectures, and locked doors. They took turns watching me, never leaving me alone. My mother cried constantly, alternating between blaming herself and begging me to repent. Pastor Thompson visited daily, reading scripture and warning about the wages of sin, but I barely heard any of it. My mind was consumed with one thought. Bobby had left me behind. Had our love meant so little, or had she been forced to run, planning to return as promised? I tortured myself with questions I couldn't answer. 3 days into my imprisonment, Matthew slipped a note under my door while pretending to use the bathroom. It was from Bobby, somehow delivered through channels I couldn't imagine. Didn't abandon you. They were waiting at the truck. Had to run on foot. Made it to Millerville. Working at a diner. Saving money. Will come back. 3 weeks. Be ready. All my love. B. Relief flooded through me so intensely I had to sit down. She hadn't betrayed me. She was coming back. I just had to survive 3 more weeks. I became the model of repentance. I prayed when they told me to pray, cried when they expected tears, and spoke of seeing the error of my ways. Pastor Thompson remained suspicious, but my mother desperately wanted to believe her daughter could be saved. Slowly, they relaxed their vigilance. I was allowed to return to work at the general store, though my mother dropped me off and picked me up. I attended every church service, every prayer meeting, every Bible study. I became the daughter they'd always wanted, outwardly. Inside, I counted days. Bobby sent updates through Matthew, who'd become our unlikely ally. She was working double shifts, sleeping in a shelter, saving every penny. 2 weeks, 10 days, 1 week, then 5 days before her planned return, everything shattered again. David Henderson had been watching me, following my movements, suspicious of my sudden transformation. He'd seen Matthew delivering a note and intercepted the next one. The confrontation was explosive. Pastor Thompson waved Bobby's latest note like a flag of victory, condemning me for my deception. My parents were devastated. They'd believed my repentance was real. This time, there would be no second chances. Conversion therapy, my father announced, his voice hollow. There's a program in Texas. You leave tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word echoed in my mind. Bobby was coming in 5 days, but I'd be hundreds of miles away, locked in some facility designed to pray away who I was. That night, as my mother packed my clothes through her tears, I made a desperate decision. I couldn't wait for Bobby. I had to run now, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the $20 hidden in my shoe. At 3 a.m., I slipped out my window for the last time. The town slept peacefully, unaware of the girl creeping through its streets like a shadow. I made it to the highway just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky. I stood there, thumb out, praying for deliverance. A trucker stopped, heading north, willing to give a desperate girl a ride. As the truck pulled away, I watched my town disappear in the side mirror, knowing I'd never see it again. But I wasn't heading to freedom. Not yet. I was heading to Millerville, to a diner where a gap-toothed girl with grease-stained hands was saving money for a rescue that was no longer needed. The journey to find Bobby would be its own challenge, but that's where this part of my story pauses. At the moment, I chose myself, chose love, chose to run towards something instead of waiting to be saved. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, it was mine to travel. The trucker's name was Victoria, and she didn't ask questions when I climbed into her cab with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks. She just handed me a bottle of water and told me to buckle up. The highway stretched ahead of us like a promise, each mile taking me further from everything I'd known. I dozed fitfully against the window, jerking awake every time we stopped. Victoria bought me breakfast at a truck stop near the state line, eggs and toast that I could barely choke down. My stomach churned with anxiety about what I'd find in Millerville. Would Bobby still be there? Would she forgive me for leaving without her? Victoria dropped me off at the edge of Millerville just after noon. The town was bigger than mine, but still small enough that everyone probably knew everyone. I asked a woman at the gas station about diners in town, and she pointed me toward Main Street. There were 3 diners on Main Street. I started with the first one, peering through the window like a stalker. No Bobby. The second one was fancier, with cloth napkins and a hostess stand. Definitely not where someone sleeping in a shelter would work. The third diner sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the daylight. Through the grimy window, I saw her. Bobby moved between tables with a coffee pot, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted, thinner than before, but still beautiful. I pushed through the door, the bell above it announcing my arrival. Bobby turned at the sound, and the coffee pot slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Dark liquid spread across the linoleum as she stood frozen, staring at me like I was a ghost. The other waitress started fussing about the mess, but Bobby didn't move. I crossed the diner in 3 strides and pulled her into my arms. She was real, solid, smelling like coffee and grease and home. You're here, she whispered against my neck. How are you here? The other waitress, her name tag said Tori, shooed us toward the back while she cleaned up the coffee. In the tiny break room, I told Bobby everything. David intercepting the note, the conversion therapy threat, my desperate escape in the night. She held my face in her hands, those beautiful brown eyes searching mine. You chose me, she said, wonder in her voice. You actually chose me. I chose us, I corrected, and then she was kissing me, right there in the break room of a rundown diner, and nothing else mattered. Bobby's shift ended at 6. She took me to the shelter where she'd been staying, a cramped building that smelled like disinfectant and despair. We couldn't stay there together. They had strict rules about visitors, but Bobby had saved almost $200 in the 3 weeks since she'd fled. Combined with what you have, we can get out of here, she said, counting bills again. Maybe not far, but somewhere. We found a motel that rented by the week, paying cash for a room with a kitchenette and a bed that sagged in the middle. It wasn't much, but it was ours. That first night, we held each other and made plans. Real plans this time, not the desperate dreams of teenagers. Bobby got me a job at the diner the next day. Tori, the other waitress, turned out to be the owner's daughter. She took one look at us and seemed to understand everything. Y'all running from something? She asked bluntly. When we nodded, she just shrugged. Aren't we all? Can you work doubles? The work was hard. My feet ached constantly, and I went home every night smelling like fryer oil. But every morning I woke up next to Bobby, free to kiss her without fear, free to hold her hand on the street, free to be myself. We'd been in Millerville for 2 weeks when I saw him. I was wiping down tables near the window when a familiar figure walked past. My blood turned to ice. David Henderson, Pastor Thompson's spy, was here in Millerville. I ducked behind the counter, my heart pounding. Had they sent him to find me? Was my family here too? Bobby noticed my panic immediately, following my gaze to where David stood across the street, looking at his phone. Back door, she hissed, and we both slipped out through the kitchen. We ran to our motel room and threw our few belongings into bags. We'd We'd saved another $150, enough to get us somewhere else. But when we reached the bus station, David was there too. He saw us before we could hide, his face lighting up with triumph. He started toward us, pulling out his phone, probably to call Pastor Thompson or my parents. Then something unexpected happened. A police officer approached David, asking to see his ID. We watched from behind a pillar as David grew increasingly agitated, gesturing wildly. The officer remained calm but firm, eventually escorting David away from the station. Tori appeared beside us, slightly out of breath. Saw that boy following y'all, she said. Told the officer he'd been harassing my employees. Small town cops don't take kindly to outsiders causing trouble. We stared at her in shock. She'd protected us, this woman we barely knew. Why? Bobby asked. Tori shrugged. My girlfriend and I had to run once too. Somebody helped us. Now I'm helping you. She pressed something into my hand, an envelope. Inside was $300 and a business card. My cousin Nathan runs a restaurant in Asheville. He's always looking for good workers. Tell him I sent you. The bus to Asheville left an hour later. As we pulled out of Millerville, I saw David arguing with a police officer, his face red with frustration. He'd have to go back and report his failure. Maybe they'd send someone else. Maybe they wouldn't. But we'd be long gone. The bus ride took 6 hours. Bobby fell asleep against my shoulder, her hand in mine. I watched the landscape change outside the window, mountains rising up to replace the flat lands I'd always known. Each mile felt like a year falling away, like I was aging in reverse, becoming someone new. Nathan's restaurant was nothing like the diner. It was bright and clean, with plants in the windows and music playing softly. Nathan himself was a large man with kind eyes who took one look at Tori's note and hired us both on the spot. She says you're hard workers running from religious families, he said simply. That's enough for me. Can you start tomorrow? We found a tiny apartment above a laundromat. It was noisy and hot, but it had 2 windows that faced east, and every morning the sun woke us up together. We bought a mattress from a thrift store and ate dinner on the floor until we could afford a table. The work at Nathan's restaurant was different from the diner. I learned to make fancy coffee drinks and remember complicated orders. Bobby worked in the kitchen, her quick hands perfect for the fast-paced environment. We made friends with the other employees, people who didn't ask too many questions about our past. 3 months in, I was making a latte when I heard a familiar voice. My hands froze on the espresso machine. My mother stood at the counter looking older and smaller than I remembered. She was alone. Our eyes met across the coffee bar. I waited for her to scream, to condemn me, to drag me back. Instead, she just looked tired. A small coffee, please, she said quietly. I made her coffee with shaking hands. When I handed it to her, she pressed a folded paper into my palm along with the money. Then she left without another word. I unfolded the paper in the bathroom, Bobby holding me as I read. I pray for you every day, not for your soul to be saved, but for your happiness. I'm sorry I couldn't be the mother you needed. Maybe someday you can forgive me. I told them I couldn't find you. We both cried then, grieving for the families we'd lost and the acceptance we'd never have. But we had each other, and we had this life we were building one day at a time. 6 months later, on a warm September evening, we sat on our fire escape watching the sunset. We'd saved enough to buy a real bed and a small TV. Bobby had been promoted to sous chef. I was taking night classes to get my GED. I've been thinking, Bobby said, playing with my hair. We should write to Matthew, let him know we're okay. I thought about my young cousin, the boy who'd kept our secret and helped us communicate. He'd be 13 now, probably taller, maybe starting to question things himself in that suffocating town. We wrote the letter together, careful not to include any identifying information about where we were. We told him we were safe and happy, that love was worth fighting for, that there was a whole world beyond our little town. We mailed it to Tori, who promised to forward it through channels that couldn't be traced. The response came a month later, delivered through the same circuitous route. I'm glad you're happy. I'm keeping your secret and keeping my own now too. Maybe someday I'll be brave like you. P.S. Pastor Thompson had a heart attack. He's fine, but retired. The new pastor seems nicer. We laughed at that, imagining Pastor Thompson's fury at being replaced. But mostly we felt hope. For Matthew, for others like us still trapped in that town, for the future we were building. Our first Christmas together, we couldn't afford a tree. Bobby brought home a potted rosemary plant from the restaurant, and we decorated it with paper stars. We exchanged gifts we'd made ourselves. I'd knitted her a scarf. She'd built me a bookshelf from salvaged wood. As snow fell outside our window, we slow danced to music from our phone, the rosemary plant twinkling with our makeshift decorations. I thought about the girl I'd been, so scared and quiet, convinced I'd never have this. Now here I was, dancing in a tiny apartment with the love of my life, free to be exactly who I was. What are you thinking about? Bobby asked, pulling me closer. Just that I'm happy, I said. Really, truly happy. She smiled, that gap-toothed grin that still made my heart race. Me too, baby. Me too. As we swayed together, I knew there would still be challenges. We were young, poor, and far from home. Some days were harder than others. Some nights I still woke up in a panic, afraid it was all a dream. But every morning Bobby was there beside me, real and warm and mine. We'd chosen each other over everything else, and that choice had led us here, to this life, this freedom, this love that felt like finally coming home. Looking back now, I can see how young and scared we were, how impossible it all seemed, but we did it. We got out, we survived, we built something beautiful from nothing but determination and love. And every day, when I wake up next to her in our tiny apartment above the laundromat, I thank God for sending me exactly the angel I needed, a loud, gap-toothed rebel who taught me that love is always worth a risk.